we are now moving on to discussant comment, and Brett, if you can give us some comments, and we'll move on to the general discussion.
All right, thank you very much. And I guess as the last formal speaker for today, it's my pleasure to, first of all, thank the symposium organizers. I've done a couple of these electronic symposia, and I know they're not easy, but first of all, Habu Sensei, thank you very much. Kumi Hadler, thank you for all the logistics, and I'm not sure where he exists, maybe just in the ethosphere, but Invisible Brian, thank you for all that you're doing to make this conference possible. So I'm just going to keep my my remarks short, so we have time for some question and answer at the end. But I just want to frame it maybe some slightly bigger picture issues. So I teach a course every year called The World Environment, and I've been teaching it for years. It's very big, it's lower division, and it's kind of a grab bag of things that I happen to be interested in at the time. But one of the things that I'm continually interested in is the agricultural revolution. And in teaching about when it is that human beings began to domesticate plants and animals, and what sort of impact that has on the emergence of states and administration, specialized forms of commerce, writing, tool making, all the kind of things that somebody like Jared Diamond might talk about in his broader thinking about the role of agriculture. And I have to say, one of the things I really enjoyed about these presentations, and I mean this quite sincerely, is they forced me to really rethink a lot of sort of bedrock assumptions I had about what the agricultural revolution might have looked like. You know, what is the agricultural revolution? What does it look like for people to turn to agriculture, whether it's lacquer or whether it's barnyard grasses or whether it's acorns, and how does that fit into their subsistence patterns? And maybe more specifically, what does domestication itself look like? Maybe it doesn't have to be immediately people sowing grains, but maybe it can be more informal means of planting, and then it develops into something more formalized later. And then I think maybe the lesson that Habu Sensei wanted to push with the seminar or the symposium more broadly is, do we have something that we can learn from past subsistence practices, specifically, in which he's talking about the efficiencies of monoculture, and did even Jomon folks run into problems because they became over-reliant with certain kinds of plants in their agriculture. So I have to say I learned a lot. So let me start with Kome-Ie's paper, first of all. So 20 years ago now, it's kind of hard to believe, 20 years ago now, I wrote a paper on the wild boar famine in Hachinohe. It occurred in 1749. And basically the thinking is that it was a variety of environmental factors, but in large part it had to do with swidden agriculture in Hachinohe, that farmers there had begun to burn down much of the hillsides, not for planting subsistence crops like millet and barnyard grass, but for planting soybeans. And the reason that they were planting soybeans was because all of the agricultural lands around Edo had been converted to mulberry leaves for the silk industry. And so the basic framework in the 18th century, in sort of 18th century Japan's commercialized economy, was the farmers around the city of Edo weren't growing food crops anymore because there was more money to be made in mulberry. And so they were going further afield to places like Hachinohe, where they were burning down their hillsides to plant soybeans. But all the soybeans were being shipped to Edo to make tofu and miso and all those good things. Combined with the Little Ice Age, which hits Japan particularly badly in the 18th century, it leads to what ecologists call an ungulate eruption, when the circumstances are such that there's an explosion of the wild boar population. They eat the farmers out of house and home, and it causes a famine. So I was always under the impression that swidden was bad, that swidden basically was indiscriminate. It just burned things down. it killed the kind of natural ecological diversity. But one of the things that I learned from Komei's paper was that that's not necessarily the case. And in fact, in some respects, it facilitates local diversity. But I think the operative term in Komei's paper, and this would be the operative term in all three of the papers that I had the pleasure of reading, would be that Sweden functioned well if managed properly. If managed properly. And that is to say, what I would say is that maybe management is an okay word and rules are a good word. McKean says they had a lot of rules. I would say that mutual ownership seems to be one of the operative things. And I'll get to this point later when I'm in a second. And that is to say that when people through their labor and through their activities take mutual ownership in their manipulation of the land, that something like Sweden seems to function more effectively. So my opinion of what Sweden is transformed from a sort of brutal practice of burning down acorn trees and planting monocrops of soybeans appears to have not been what was happening in most cases, but rather that it facilitated diversity. It facilitated early forms of this kind of pseudo plantation agriculture with Japanese cypress trees, and therefore had a very important role to play in Japan. Habu Sensei's paper does much the same thing. In this same class that I was speaking about, the world environment, one of the documentaries I show is King Corn, which is a documentary on the role of industrialized corn production in the United States. And it really focuses on the Nixon and Ford administration Secretary of Agriculture, a man by the name of Earl Butz, who believed that monocrop agriculture was the key to success in the United States. And basically his thinking was, if people spend less money on food, they can buy more radios and televisions. And so we basically need to drive down the cost of food, and you do that through monocrop production. But one of the things I love about Habu Sensei's paper is that this kind of had been tried before. It seems like the road to efficiency always is through monocrop agriculture, but that there's some reason to believe, it's not concrete yet, but the direction that these archaeologists and historians are heading in is that monocrop agriculture could have very early on led to some sort of subsistence and maybe even economic hardships that we don't know about. And so not only does the agricultural revolution become important as a kind of historical event, but in terms of teaching some of the lessons of the human relationship with the land, it is important as well. But again, it seems to me that the operative word here is management. Is that, is there evidence of people coming together to mutually claim ownership of the land and to manage the land? That seems to be the key to this working. Finally, Professor McKean's paper, which I loved because I have to say, and I rarely admit this in public, particularly with 100 people watching this online, I'm a Garrett Hardin fan. I actually believe the tragedy of the commons is accurate. And, I have a lot of anecdotal evidence for that. I mean, if you go, I live in Montana, and if you go to, state forest land, it's filled with old cars and discarded refrigerators. Mm-hmm. If you go to private property, it's beautiful. It's got like these robust elk populations. And I've always thought this is classic Garrett Hardin. If it's a common area, people crap on it. And if it's public property, if it's private property, they take care of it because it's theirs. And there's a lot of evidence that this kind of thing worked in Japan. There's work on fisheries, coastal fisheries, for example, that suggests that this idea of private property actually extended to littorals into the water, and people actually kind of took care of the fishery populations in these coastal regions. But I think Professor McKean tips her hand when she says that she actually had this email exchange with Hardin about it, and he said that it was probably mistitled, that it should have been the unmanaged commons where the tragedy occurs. And so I guess the lesson I think of these papers is that, excuse me, is that management seems to be the key And whether it doesn't have to be in the form of an individual landowner in Hardin's kind of imagination of laissez-faire land ownership and capitalism, but it can be community forms of ownership where people have a long-term vision of what sustainability of the land looks like. They put sets of rules on that usufruct and that usage of that land, which enables it to be useful and endure. And in many ways, it has become one of the sort of a classic example of yet one more contribution that Japan makes to our understandings of how capitalism and other economic forms work in the world. Whether it's the kind of commons that Professor McKean talks about, or the ones that I'm more familiar with that are like what Professor Philip Brown has talked about with the warichi and some of these other kinds of common lands and villages. These were pervasive and they were important and they were sustained even as land was being privatized under Hideyoshi and some of the 17th century unifiers. But I think it continues to point to the importance of engagement and management in these lands. So let me just end by saying, I think that's an important corrective in one, how we think about the role of commons and private property, particularly in this paradigm of the tragedy in commons. But two, the way we think about the lingering impact of the agricultural revolution more broadly and more globally. That it wasn't this kind of Rousseauian vision of the earliest man or woman sinking a shovel in the ground and saying, "This is mine. In order to enforce this is mine, I need an administrative apparatus called the state. And in order to have the state, I need to have records of land ownership, and therefore I invent writing systems." That maybe it's not all related to individual ownership, but that there's more collective visions of how agriculture might have looked like, and that Japan is a classic and enduring example of that. So I'll end it there to leave room for more discussion. But again, thank you for a group of very interesting papers.
Thank you very much, Brett.